Welcome, everybody. I can see participant numbers starting to climb as we kick off this webinar today. I'm going to give just a few moments to let people join, and then really we've got a lot to cover and a lot to discuss. So looking forward to getting into the conversations. Welcome. My name's Nick Medhurst. I am the head of the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, working with Martin Landray on that project, and delighted to be invited by Trudie Lang and the Global Health Network today as we explore together updated ICH GCP guidelines. Let's move to the next slide now. You see my name at the top there. I'm really just going to take us through this bit of housekeeping, but really to set a little bit of the context. We brought this webinar together because we're nearly at the end of a 5-year process where the ICH have been updating good clinical practice guidelines, initiated in 2019 to modernize and focus the stipulations of good clinical practice. We've had a pandemic since then, and a focus on what it really means to drive quality in clinical research, and particularly in clinical trials. And we have now the finalized new principles of GCP and Annex 1 available for everybody to access. It's also worth noting that Annex 2 to the updated good clinical practice guideline is currently out for public consultation, and we will talk a little bit about that in future, later on in the call. So I'm really delighted to be introducing both Martin and Trudie onto this call today. Apart from their many contributions to clinical research and global health across their careers, they have consistently dedicated themselves to advocacy for better infrastructure and better guidelines around research and trials. Their efforts last much longer than the 5 years I've just described. So really looking forward to hearing their inputs and the insights that they're bringing to this discussion today. I'm going to move on to the next slide here, just to really give you a sense of how global the Global Health Network is. I think we have 6 continents covered there, and a really wonderful spread of participants from all across the world. Antarctica just out of shot, so we might have the full 7 continents involved. But thank you to all of you for being here. It's really a community that comes together to make change on these kind of efforts, and we're proud to be able to involve everybody today in this discussion. And really, again, looking forward to the question and answer session after the presentations have taken place. So get into those, get into the Q&A there. I think I see already one question coming up, but without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Professor Sir Martin Landray to take us through this presentation. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Nick, and hello to everybody, whatever time of day or night it might be for you. It's amazing to see quite so many people, but it is an important topic. So for the next 20 minutes or so, I'm really going to take us through where the situation has evolved to with regards to guidance around clinical trials. But I thought I'd start by reflecting on why we're all here. And this is a slide I've been using for the best part of 20 years, but it's as true now as it was 20 years ago. And really, it's to recognise that clinical trials are absolutely essential if we want to make appropriate decisions about the benefits and harms of any clinical intervention, a drug, a device, a vaccine, a surgical procedure, or anything else. And to recognise that decisions that are made in the absence of reliable evidence may harm individual patients or harm public health. So trials are our friend. Trials are the way that we differentiate between things that we hope work and things that we don't know do work. And the challenge is that so often decisions are made in the absence of reliable evidence, either because relevant trials are never done or because they're done badly. They're not designed properly, they're not conducted well, they're not analysed well, or they're not reported well, or indeed at all. And as I say, that's damaging to both to individual patients and individual clinical decisions, but also at public health policy level and so on. If we go to the next slide, if we look over what the current landscape looks like, well, in COVID, the leadership of the FDA in the United States identified that just 5% of all the clinical trials of treatments for COVID were adequately designed. So 95% of the trials were, if you like, doomed from failure from the moment the protocol was written. If we move away from that, we see that you see it in both the commercial and the non-commercial setting that many trials fail to recruit to time and target. We see that the cost and complexity of clinical trials is growing exponentially, and that makes it harder to do the sorts of trials we need to do to get the sort of evidence we need to get to improve individual patient care and public health. And also, we still have a huge gap. I mean, I work in cardiovascular disease predominantly, and even in my area, which many would think was at the forefront of evidence-based medicine, just 15% of what is written in the big international guidelines is based on good evidence from randomized clinical trials. So we need evidence, we need reliable evidence if we're going to practice good medicine. Good trials are a key component of a good healthcare system. So if we move on, what are the barriers? Well, there are many barriers, poor design being one. I've highlighted that. Cumbersome execution, underuse of information that's already collected and already out there, a bunch of sort of technical naivety and siloed thinking, some misaligned incentives. But for today, what we're going to focus on is the regulatory issues. And I've called this regulatory overinterpretation because there are challenges here, both in what is written and how it is applied, both by those who are trying to conduct trials and those who have some form of oversight, approval, regulatory or other decision-making function that sits above clinical trials. And it's really that I think is a major concern, but I think there are grounds for optimism. If we go to the next slide. So the ICH Good Clinical Practice, or GCP guidance, originated back in 1996, which means it was written in the years before that. And much of the mindset that went into that original guidance was based on the state of the art and the state of the world, if you like, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. So really a very long time ago. The authorship of ICH GCP is a range of regulators, and I'll show you this a little bit later, and industry societies. There are no patient groups, there's no academic groups, there's no non-commercial funders, there's no IRB or ethics groups or and so on contributing to that process directly. The ICH is a club of regulators and industry. It sets itself out, it claims this is an international scientific quality standard, and it tries to provide, originally at least, a unified standard for the European Union, Japan, and the United States. And it's expanded a lot beyond there in terms of geographic footprint and indeed membership of different regulatory agencies. And although it's really focused on clinical trials for treatments that might be heading towards the regulator for regulatory approval, the ICH themselves say, well, it may be applied to other clinical investigations. And that statement has been wildly overinterpreted in the past. Let's move on. So a bunch of issues and concerns have been raised over a number of years and are indeed recognised by ICH itself, and hence the latest revisions. First of all, that actually the guidance is more what to do and write it down rather than what are the principles. And it's been applied much more widely than initially intended, including to clinical trials that have nothing to do with the regulatory submission. And indeed, wrongly, it's been applied to research studies that have nothing to do with clinical trials. And the worry and what led to the revision in the late, about 5 or 6 years ago, was really that it wasn't working even for industry trials or for non-commercial trials, that it wasn't thinking about what the 21st century world looks like, and it wasn't involving the input from patients and academic trialists and so on and so forth. So that led to calls for a revision. Now, before we go on to the details of the revision, it's worth taking a step back and thinking for ourselves, next slide, please, what really does good guidance look like? And this is work that our sort of original work at the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, which is funded by Wellcome and Gates. And I think that this slide we've been pleased with because it has actually lasted the test of time. So good guidance should really focus on the key scientific and ethical principles. It should be clear and concise, and it should be inclusively developed. There are a lot of different people with different perspectives and different experiences in different parts of the world, focused on different diseases, different medical interventions, but also coming from different angles and having different skills. And the best guidance would be progressive and durable, be widely applicable across a whole range of different settings, and it would be forward-looking. It's easy to regulate for the past, you've seen that, but the challenge is how do you regulate for the future? And really the only way to do that is to stick to principles. If you go to the next slide, please. These are the principles that we developed as part of the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, a co-development with all those different stakeholders over a couple of years in about 2020, 2021. 5 key themes. A good trial produces a scientifically sound answer to a relevant question, and then it sets out a series of sub-themes. It respects the rights and well-being of the participants. Again, that's both about the ethical issues and the consent issues, but also about monitoring individual person safety. It's collaborative and transparent. Trials are not done in isolation. They're done with people, with patients, with communities, with healthcare organizations, and so on. And they need to be feasible for the context. And the context can vary enormously widely, depending on whether it's urban or rural, in a well-resourced or less resourced part of the world, whether it's in the middle of a pandemic, whether it's in intensive care unit, or whether it's in the community, and so on. And finally, manages quality effectively, efficiently. And that guidance was produced, as I say, and published in about 2022. And as we'll see in a moment, was later adopted into the WHO. So if we go to the next slide. As a consequence, largely, of the pandemic and a number of reports that came out of that, the World Health Assembly passed a resolution essentially instructing the World Health Organization to develop guidances on best practices for clinical trials and to engage with non-state actors to strengthen capabilities, particularly in developing countries, and on the innovations that are needed to support the needs of all populations, including those that are typically underserved in one way or another. We go to the next slide. And this is on one slide is what the WHO guidance says. Down the left are the WHO words. This is quoted direct from the WHO, best practices guidelines. Good trials are designed to produce scientifically sound answers to relevant questions, respect the rights and well-being of participants. They're collaborative and transparent. They're feasible for their context, and they manage the quality effectively and efficiently. I posted on the summary from the GCTC guidance on the right-hand side, and you can see that these pretty much exactly match. And that's right, because indeed the best practices guidance, this section of it that the WHO have published, essentially makes full use of what was written by the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, what was co-developed by the community, the very broad global community that has interest in clinical trials. Let's move to the next slide, please. So all that is about where we are on the sort of evolution from a challenge to recognizing what good guidance looks like, to developing the key principles, to the adoption of those key principles by the WHO. Let's go back to the ICH and say, where is that? Well, these are the members and observers. I think this slide may or may not be completely up to date because there are constant changes. But again, to reiterate, that this is dominated in terms of membership by the regulatory agencies and by, on the right-hand side at the top right-hand corner, some industry groups, not individual companies, but industry groups. There's a whole bunch of observers, but again, what you'll see is amongst the membership, it is simply regulators and industry, not the rest of all those different perspectives that might be relevant to clinical trials. And when it comes to writing the good clinical practice guidance, then the authorship, the expert working group that wrote the guidance, is drawn from the members at the top of this, and it's particularly drawn from those who are in the inspection side of the membership, rather than those, for example, who might be approving or refusing approval of new treatments, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to the next slide. Over a period of the last 5 years, the ICH, recognizing the challenges that have happened that I highlighted earlier, have produced new guidance. So E6 happens to be the sort of code name, if you like. It is the name, the official name of what most other people would call the GCP, or Good Clinical Practice Guidance. And R3 this is release 3. This is the third version, the original version from 1996, a version which had some very minor modifications in about 2016 or so. And then this is a sort of a fairly comprehensive restructuring of it, although there are some areas where the text is much the same. And the way they've set it out is to talk about a bunch of principles. That's a good start, a very good start. We'll come back to that. And then 2 annexes. Annex 1, which they call Considerations for Interventional Clinical Trials. This is essentially an adaptation of what was written previously, and it's the sort of almost rules and formulaic what has to be written down where that is used for typical industry trials and for many other trials as well. The principles in Annex 1 have been published. They went through a consultation or public feedback process, and they have been finalized now, and the various national and regional regulatory agencies are essentially adopting those into their standard and local sort of regulations as we speak. And so by the time we get to the second or third quarter of this year, then the principles of ICH GCP in Annex 1 will be standard regulatory requirements across most parts of the world. Annex 2, which we'll come to, is much shorter. It's actually a much better document in my view, and it includes some additional considerations, particularly around what's called decentralized trials, in other words, trials which are much closer to where patients actually live or work, the use of digital technology, and the uses of what's called real-world data in the context of clinical trials. We might come back to that. So if we go to the next slide, then here is the front page from the new guidance, Principles in Annex 1, which was adopted by the ICH on the 6th of January this year, and as I say, is going through local adoption by the individual regulatory agencies. We go to the next slide. Let's have a look at this in detail. Well, there's quite a lot to like. That's the first thing to say. This is from the sort of opening context section, if you like. The guideline applies to interventional trials that are submitted to regulatory authorities. The principles may be applicable to other interventional trials, but they are clear that this is for trials. This is not for other studies. And then they say the annexes, and I showed you those 2 annexes just now, provide a basis for appropriate interpretation. However, you can use other approaches provided they're justified and achieve the intended purpose of the principles. And so that's an important concept. Although they provide detail, the detail is not, in the words of the ICH, to be interpreted literally and always stuck to. The principles need to be obeyed and need to guide whatever we do. But if there's an alternative good solution, then there isn't a reason not to apply it. This guideline encourages, therefore, a risk-based and a proportionate approach. And those 2 words appear repeatedly throughout the whole guidance. Next slide. So this is from the principles section, which starts with about a page or so of if you like, narrative text before giving 11 detailed or more detailed and specific principles. So number one, really good to see recognized, clinical trials are a fundamental part of clinical research, and trials with inadequate design or poorly conducted are essentially bad practice. And then the second paragraph there, the principles of GCP are designed to be flexible and applicable to a broad range of clinical trials. So again, it's emphasizing that there is flexibility in how the principles are interpreted, and not to have undue rigidity or over-interpretation. Next slide. Again, in the preamble, in that sort of opening text for the principles, a very helpful statement, and the first time we've really seen it in ICH guidance: the design and conduct of clinical trial may be supported by attaining the perspective of interested parties such as patients, their communities, patient advocacy groups, and healthcare professionals. Really good to see that there. Next slide, please. And finally, before we get into the detail of the principles, again, that quality by design should be implemented. And what they mean by is that one should think about what are the things that are really matter in order to understand the impact on the reliability of results and the right safety and well-being of participants. And that clinical trial processes and risk mitigation strategies need to be proportionate to essentially to what are those critical to quality factors. And a very helpful statement: trial design should be operationally feasible and avoid unnecessary complexity. And I think we all are familiar with clinical trial protocols that are far from operationally feasible, have a lot of unnecessary complexity, and that is a barrier to participation, both by clinicians and investigators, but also by patients and the public. And as a consequence, if a trial is not operationally feasible, then actually the question that it asks, however good that question, never gets answered. Next slide. There are, as I say, 11 principles then set out, and they're generally very sound, although is there room for some improvement. So although they're in the text, it says, well, involving patients and the public and clinicians and so on is a good thing, that's not actually one of the 11 principles, which is a real shame, I think, and something that's missing. Likewise, there is a requirement to make the results of the trials publicly available, but that, in my view, is rather weak, and it's certainly not at the level that, for example, the WHO guidance, not only just the best practices guidance from last year, but previous guidances would really be seeking. And it also remains somewhat anchored in an outdated view of what different organizations do, the sponsor and the investigator and so on. So to give you some examples, you know, we all know that there are some trials where services might otherwise be delivered that might normally be delivered by the investigator, such as, I don't know, providing, handing out the study drug, might sensibly be delivered by the sponsor, for example, organizing a central laboratory, as a central pharmacy. Of course, some data might be acquired centrally by the sponsor, for example, laboratory data, hospital admission data, death registry data might actually bypass the investigator and sensibly go straight into the database held by the sponsor. The investigator, of course, in some instances is the same thing as the sponsor, and that's not really well recognized. And in some cases, the sponsor of the trial might be an academic organization, or I don't know, the WHO or a health ministry or something, may in fact be different to the organization that then submits for licensing approval. And there's a lot of confusion about what the definition of the word sponsor actually means, and that unfortunately still persists in the new guidance. But as I say, the principles are basically sound, and the text that goes before them is even better. And so I think we should at least celebrate that. Next. I think my main concern, and that of many others, is of overinterpretation and rigid implementation. So I worry, others worry too, that people will read the guidance from the back forwards. In other words, they'll look at the details of what documents need to be stored, rather than what are the principles, which is what's at the front. And that, I think, is going to be the challenge, is to keep reminding people principles are the priority, principles are the priority, and everything else needs to be proportionate and appropriately applied to match those principles. Next slide, please. I'll give you a couple of examples before I finish. So here is one on investigator records. So the investigator should ensure the accuracy, completeness, legibility, etc. of the data. Fine. And then the investigator should review and endorse the reported data at important milestones. Well, it's not clear what the value of endorsing the data is. If the data were entered by one of the investigators' trained and staff, for example, at patient interviews, it's very difficult for the investigator to know what is or isn't correct, given that they weren't present at that interview. And the investigator, of course, may sensibly delegate tasks, as I say, to experienced and trained people. And there are, in any case, other ways to check for errors, central statistical monitoring, and many other sort of more sophisticated measures. So this is just an example where there's a bit too much detail in the annex. And if you only read that line, then you wouldn't be thinking in a principle-based and flexible approach. So read the principles, think about the principles and how to apply them to your circumstance. Next slide, please. This one is about sponsor data handling. So the sponsor shouldn't make changes to the data entered by the investigator unless agreed by the investigator. Well, what if the investigator's left? What if the investigator is the problem? We've all got trials where that happens to be the case. And then second, the sponsor should allow corrections if the investigator or the patients ask for them. Well, there are times when that also can introduce new issues, new errors, or even in bias, that bias into the results. So it can actually be detrimental to trial quality. So again, it's about, let's think about the principles of what we're trying to achieve, as opposed to the mechanics of how to apply it. So whilst what's written in this annex is generally a reasonable thing, there are other ways of delivering on the principles. So next, these are just two examples of, if you read from the back forwards, you'll get it wrong. Read from the top first and think about the principles, And that, of course, is exactly what the WHO guidance urges. Think about the principles first. Next slide, please. So this Annex 2, the Annex 2, as I say, is really tackling the sort of new types of trials, which are so-called decentralized elements. Personally, I don't like the phrase, but essentially what that's saying is that not all aspects of a clinical trial need to happen with the patient in a clinical trial site. Some might be done by the patient at home. Some might be done by the patient going to a community facility. There are other ways of doing these things. There might be some more pragmatic elements, as we saw in some trials during the pandemic, and there might be use of real-world data and digital technologies. For example, for patients to report symptoms and other things. This annex is out for public consultation at the moment. The way it works is that individual agencies then are accepting the comments, and you can. We've done our best to find the dates of the key agencies which feed into the ICH process. And I recognise there are many other agencies, there are many other countries, but this is with a ICH view in mind. These are the routes by which one can get feedback into these agencies, or as I'm sure Nick will cover later on, via us. If we go to my next slide, please. So the key elements of our response, we've been through this carefully, and we've involved a lot of people in helping construct this response with different perspectives, is again, we need to re-emphasize that principles are the priority. That secondly, that there is still some undue restriction between the roles of sponsor and investigator, not sufficient flexibility. And then thirdly, that engagement with patients is still underemphasized, as well as involvement of healthcare professionals and one or two other things. So I'm going to finish there if I have my final slide, just to say thank you and hand over to others, and then we can have some discussion later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Martin. I hope a lot of food for thought there for questions to come through. We already have plenty, which we'll be fielding shortly, but without further ado, I'll go across to Trudie Lang. Thank you, Trudie.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining. How wonderful to see over 1,000 of our colleagues from around the world here. And Martin, that was just a great introduction to ICH GCP and the challenges that we've faced with ICH GCP over the years, and hopefully the very positive changes that are happening with R3. What I'd like to do in this presentation is just think about how ICH is applied in various settings around the world, and also to think about the new context of R3 and if this can help us apply ICH more appropriately in many settings and give us the flexibility that perhaps it needs. So I'm delighted to be talking to you through the Global Health Network community. There's over 1 million in this community now, and we've got, as I say, over 1,000 listening to us today on this in this meeting. So let's hope it's a really collaborative discussion today. Okay, so what we really want to do today is just think about ICH GCP and the application in really every setting that you are all working in around the globe. What we're going to have time to do very shortly is really open this up for discussion. So please use the Q&A function within this and share your thoughts on your experience of working with ICH and what you know already or what you've learned today about the changes that R3 are going to bring, because we really want to make sure that we give the opportunity for understanding much more about how applicable this is going to be. So, as Martin said, you know, ICH in its underpinning goal is a good thing, right? We all need clinical trials to be safe and ethical and accurate. And the reality is that clinical trials exist within an ecosystem of all types of health research. Of course, to tackle every disease, we need all these different types of research, and clinical trials are an absolutely vital part of that ecosystem. What is also true is that many teams are applying ICH GCP to many forms of clinical trials, but also sometimes wider forms of health research studies. And this is because they're asked to by their ethics committees, funders, publishers. And so even when they're not taking on clinical trials for regulatory purposes, they might be even be doing an observational study or a different design. But this is where we get the call out to this through finally through this R3 revision, where it does acknowledge that ICH GCP, whilst it's been built and is designed by regulatory agencies with those stakeholders, there is the acknowledgement finally that they are used in other contexts. And the whole intent of ICH GCP is that they are guidelines, and they're intended to be then adapted and interpreted to the risk and complexity of your study. But many of us have been working in this field for decades, we know that's really difficult. And actually there's a lot of expertise required to be able to take ICH GCP and work out what you need to apply for your study. So next slide, please. So we know that there's huge inequity in where research happens, and that we know that, you know, we're still in this reality that over 90% of the world's research benefits less than 10% of the population. And there's a really great resource on the WHO website, the Observatory, where you can have a look at all these sorts of stats. But it just makes it clear what we of course know, that hardly any clinical trials happen in LMICs. And then even those that do happen, they're often led from elsewhere and not designed locally. And then really what we're trying to do, of course, is think about how do we address that inequity? And our hope really is that R3 does go some way towards that. And also we've got the WHO guidelines, and these guidelines are written to implement the WHO resolution on clinical trials. And this is all about addressing this inequity in terms of where trials happen, but making sure that then that trials are supported and they're really well designed and they answer the question they're setting to do. So we really hope that R3 can make a difference in bringing this equity and really helping people run good quality studies. Next slide, please. So we have done a lot of work over the years, probably with many of you on this call, to understand the barriers to running clinical trials in your teams. And the really I suppose, reassuring, but sometimes depressing reality is that when we've asked this question, and we've done this in probably 4 or 5 different studies now, and we can lay the results on top of each other, we know that the barriers to running good studies and good clinical trials don't differ whether you're working on HIV, malaria, TB, malnutrition, an outbreak. And also, we can do the same piece of research on a randomized, really complicated RCT or an observational study or teams that work on all of them, and we get the same answer. So we really know that some of the barriers that people need are really solvable, actually, and these is what we're trying to do with the Global Health Network, is really work with you all to get you to share how you solve these barriers and overcome these pieces. The first one you can see is access to skills training, and when we talk to teams about this and provide the resources they need, it really is accessing that ability to interpret ICH GCP and work out what you need to do with your studies to make them accurate, safe and ethical. And so through this lens of thinking about how we can solve this, I'm quite interested to look at R3 and the changes and alongside the World Health Organization guidelines and think about how we can really take up this opportunity with R3 and the new guidance to really help people interpret ICH GCP for their very own very particular settings. Next slide, please. So here, I think it's really important that we think about R3 and the WHO guidelines as together. I really believe, and I really do have, you know, this is decades of working with many of you on this issue. This is the most transformative opportunity that we've had literally for over 30 years. I think this potential that R3 has, or the will, and to really help people apply adaptively to their studies could really change this inequity. Also, some of those key points that Martin covered, the ability to be agile and flexible in the design, but also looking at things like quality and how trials are monitored and assessed. Community engagement is absolutely vital, and it was, you know, really needs to be in there. Studies need to be planned in and operated throughout and taken up within a community, and patient-centric design is the only way to achieve really high quality studies. I think the opportunity that good data science and the novel opportunities within data science are absolutely transformational. And so if these opportunities are not taken up in resource limited settings, this could even widen the gap, and that's the risk, because if they're taken up in more wealthier diseases and more wealthier regions, the gap will just widen. And so it's down to all of us, I think, to work together and make sure that the most remote and marginalized disease or study team can access the best technology and the best ability to use the latest innovation and using real world data or whatever it may be. So we're really keen to work with everybody involved to try and make sure that we can get these skills and resources to teams that need them. Next slide, please. So what we're doing over the coming weeks is trying to get ready for R3. And obviously, we've already got the WHO guidelines there. And we're going to update the ICH GCP course that we offer to cover R3. But we're going to be delivering this with all of the implementation tools that are needed to take them up into policy and practice. Already, nearly 4 million of these ICH courses have been taken on the Global Health Network, and we really want that accessibility to be the same for R3. But it's really important that we do this in partnership with all of you, because it's all around transferring know-how and skills. And really important today, we've got this great opportunity. There's 1,000 of us on this call, and so let's make sure we really utilize that to make sure that we can hear from you and understand what your barriers are. We really want to increase this equity and access to knowledge and information, so that wherever you are in the world, you've got access to the same level of information. So next slide. This is my last slide. So what we are really keen, next slide, please. Thank you. So what we're really keen to do is really hear from you today. We just think there's not been enough opportunities for people around the globe to contribute to these ICH changes in a really formal way. Nick shared earlier, and he's going to show you again now, how we can really bring voices from today into this, and that what we'll do today is try and collect your views and opinion. So I'm going to turn you back to Nick, and let's see if we've got a good 15 minutes for discussion. I saw some great questions coming through. Please write in the Q&A, and we're going to pull your questions from there. And we really look forward to having a really exciting discussion. So thank you all for attending.
Thank you very much, Trudie, and also thanks again to Martin for those presentations, and now looking forward to this conversation. I'm going to do my best to honour the very interesting and broad sets of questions that have come through here. I'm also going to ping them at either you, Martin, or Trudie, but I think you'll both have reflections on them, so chime in as necessary. One that I wanted to come to begin with is really in the context of our conversation today. And Martin, you presented on the kind of, I guess, arguably limited opportunities for people to contribute into the ICH process globally, that there are only certain regulatory authorities that are accepting public comments. There's kind of two parts to this question. One, you've been involved in some regard as an advisor at times to ICH. How have you found that experience and their ability to accept the arguments that have been put forward over many years, and that process of positive change? And perhaps what's your perspective on why there are some limitations to embracing all of the very positive recommendations that have been made?
Okay, thank you, Nick. I think first of all, it's an enormous effort that they're undertaking. So I can understand that there needs to be some limiting of how many voices they can have around the table in order to make progress. I have been the external stakeholder representative, I think is the correct title, for Europe, and they've had 6 people like me, one from each part of the world. Now, I cannot hope to represent all the people of Europe in this, but at least there was some expert input into sort of, if you like, from the clinical trialist perspective. But I do think it's a shame that they didn't have more breadth of input at the sort of co-development stage. They did have a public consultation, and I think they got something like 7,000 different responses. But responses after you've written something is a rather different thing to actually getting voices to help think about what the issues might be. And that does contrast with the GCTC work that then became the WHO guidance. In terms of their acceptance or otherwise of our advice, I think that they, in many areas, did accept that. I think the idea that principles are the priority, the idea of flexibility, I think some of those things did come through quite strongly, and the guidance is better as a consequence. But I think also when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, which is what, if you like, is in Annex 1, then I think it was much more difficult. The other thing to have sympathy about is that the problem is that this is about harmonization. Harmonization means necessarily that you end up by ending up with a document that is agreed by committee. It's a negotiated final document. And I think that in itself, just the act of negotiation has ended up with something that is not only harmonized, but also somewhat compromised in various places, for good and for bad. So I think that's why we've ended up where we are. I think the key is going to be in the interpretation. It's almost not what's written. What's written there, one could do some very good, very smart trials, but it's going to be how it's interpreted. And so training and thinking about the interpretation is important. And I think the more people are saying principles, 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 follow the principles, the better. That is a change in mindset from follow the sort of operational details.
And a brief follow on there, thank you, Martin, is we obviously, it's only one part of this GCP guideline, but the Annex 2 guideline is out for consultation. GCTC is coordinating a response there that we will lodge with the ICH directly. So those who want to support or provide comment on that draft, please do, and you'll be represented directly to the ICH there. Obviously, we can't guarantee that they will be able to or listen to those arguments completely, but that opportunity is there. Is there anything else you want to say there, Martin?
Yeah, just to add to that, that's quite correct, and I think that also gives an opportunity for those who, both from countries that are represented on ICH, they're in a sort of ICH member country, and those who are in countries that are not members of ICH. This guidance has impact on everybody because it's essentially how many clinical trials will be conducted, even in countries where the ICH has no, if you like, membership or authority directly. So if people want to contribute but couldn't see their name on the list of agencies that are receiving feedback, then I think doing it through GCTC is an effective way of doing that.
Thanks, Martin. Trudie, again, both of you will have thoughts on this, but a couple of interesting questions from Alba Silvestre, talking initially about the fact that E6R3 perhaps describes for the first time certain best practices, risk-based approaches, which are already in operation. Alba specifically picks out the EU and Spain, but certainly you'll be aware of many global trials which operate with some of the more positive aspects that are described in the new GCP. Alba also indicates that there is a decrease in the number of trials taking place, which may be to do with regulatory burden. So this kind of seesaw, I guess, in that question, that there are improved best practices. But Trudie, your experience there of that regulatory burden, but also people already operating on quality terms or risk-based approaches there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a great question throughout. And we asked about wider application, and many of the questions in the chat are around this risk-based approach. So I think what we can think about here is what we've alluded to several times, which is about the complexity and the difficulty that many teams have in interpreting and adapting ICH to the risk and complexity of their own study. And this is where I think we're really heartened to have that strong message coming through from ICH that it's all about application. But this is where teams need help and guidance to interpret the guidelines appropriately for the risks that their study has. And when we talk about risks, we mean risks there might be to how the data is captured. How do you make sure that when somebody writes 4.8 in the box, that it's 4.8, or is it 110? And then whoever the operative is, it's happens the same way, error occurring for that particular data point. So there's risk in data capture, there's risk obviously in safety, and there's risk in ethics and ethical practice. And it's what we really experience all the time is that teams need help in having the expertise to make these adjustments and practically interpret ICH for the risk and complexity of their own study. But this is also where the opportunity lies. As we've said, finally, and so Martin started out saying this is great news. Martin and I have worked together for literally decades on trying to lobby for these sorts of changes. There is that clarity that this is the point, it's about interpreting and adapting for studies. So I think it's up to all of us as a global community to try and share best practice, share how people have applied and adapted these to their own settings, and make sure that we can have that ability people to make risk-based practical adaptations and applications to make ICH work to their own context. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think a follow-up there is there are, so there's a question from Saeed in the chat here, which is and actually an anonymous question again, which is around full compliance. So one question is, full compliance with GCP is extremely expensive and resource intensive. And a question from Saeed, which is around the proliferation of 60+ page informed consent forms. And so these essentially, do we think that R3 can help us move towards correcting some of that excessive practice, or there's language in there which may benefit that kind of resource use or defensiveness in terms of certain practice? Trudie, take that as you wish, or over to Martin.
Yeah, so I'd call out the patient-centric community involvement elements as a really good way to approach this. I'm also on a working group at the moment with WHO and some others around this exact issue on removing the proliferation of 36-page consent forms. No consent form needs to be 36 pages long, and we're all often burdened with them. And it also calls out, to Martin's point about sponsor, this consent form should always be written by the people who are going to deliver that consent with the community that's going to be receiving that consent. And if that happens, then you will get a good document, and consent should never be one piece of paper either. It should be a process. And so if you've worked with the community, if you understand where the study is going to be happening, and again, what are the risks? What are the complexities of the study, and what's being asked of the patients that they need to understand? So patient-centric design across all elements, and obviously involving them in consent, is really key. And so this is where we welcome that this is all finally called out, at least in the annexes to R3, and certainly in the WHO guidelines. And these are the opportunities for those to be applied. And my wish is never to see a 36-page consent form ever again.
So making sure we capture this, TGHN's training has been enormously useful and popular and widely taken up on ICH GCP revision 2. There are plans for a training for R3, is that correct?
Yes, absolutely. We're really hard at work at that at the moment, and it will be the training courses so people can have their approved certificates that are accepted very widely. We have them fully recognised by all the organisations that are needed, so you can have your free ICH GCP R3 certificate. Much more important is we want to provide the training with guidance and help to adapt and implement to your setting, and it'll be those implementation tools that we hope will be most useful.
Thank you very much. And Martin, across to you, there's a question, a specific question on quality by design, QBD, but others which are around how do you make judgments about what's proportionate and what's proportionate practice in a trial, with a document, the updated document, advising proportionate or flexible approach in some respects. Perhaps those concepts are linked. I know that you were you're a big advocate of QBD and brought it into clinical trials, or helped bring it into clinical trials. Can you just explain that concept a little more?
Yeah, first thing to say, the concept's been around about 10 to 15 years now, since we first introduced it. If you want a definition of quality in a clinical trial, is the avoidance of issues that would make a material difference to a decision you might make. So a decision that a participant might make about whether to take part in the trial or not, a decision that might be made about whether the participant should continue on the treatment or not, for example, around a safety issue, or an issue that might make a material difference to a conclusion you might draw about whether let's call it a drug, really does reduce the risk of whatever it's supposed to reduce the risk of heart attack or malaria or whatever else it might be. That concept of this error in context would make a material difference to a decision you might make. But E6, this guidance, does say go and look at another ICH guidance, so-called E8, E8 is about general principles for trials and mentions a bit more about quality by design. But in my view, if you really want to know about holistically about what makes a good clinical trial, then that's the time to go to the WHO best practices. If you actually want to, leave the regulatory and all the rest of it besides, the stuff that you sort of feel you have to do, and say, actually, what do we, what does success look like? What does a good trial look like? Go to the WHO guidance, because it covers not just how do you keep record keeping, that's important, but it covers things like how do we get reliable results? How do we make sure that the people in the trial are looked after? How do we make sure that this is a feasible trial for its context? How do we make sure that this is all delivered efficiently? And how do we make sure that the data are and other processes are managed carefully? We need good regulation. It's a bit like if you want to drive your car faster, you better have good brakes. You need good regulation so that we can do better trials and answer more questions. But if you want to know about quality by design, and you want to know about what are the issues that matter, then I think the WHO best practices guidance is the place to look for that. And there is training material coming from the WHO and others that will go round that. So I think it's important to keep in mind there are certain obligations, if you like, which are principle based, so they sort of feed from that end forwards, if you like. And then there's actually what makes a good trial, which then feeds into what you would want to do. And in the ideal trial, those two things meet, and they normally do meet. Yeah, I would urge people not just to say, oh, how do we comply with some set of rules, but actually, what does a good trial look like, including things like working with participants in the community and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much, Martin. We're at time, so I'm just going to ask Louis to represent the slides which have the link to the post-webinar survey, and also a final reminder on the GCTC's Annex 2 work here. So please, you see down the bottom there, goodtrials.org/Annex 2. Go there to read and support that. And onto the next slide here, please. We'll share this link with you, but or please use the QR there. But feedback on today's webinar. There are other questions that we will get to in due course. But thank you for everybody who's participated. This won't be the last, I'm sure, that you'll hear from TGHN or GCTC on this process of transitioning across to ICH E6R3. Certainly that transition is the subject of a number of questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. But once again, thank you very much for your participation today, and thank you to Martin, Trudie for your great presentations, but really to the whole community for your work to take us forward together. Thank you.